Hi again. I got cut off in the last video, ran out of batteries, but that was actually a fairly good stopping place and where I would have broken for classes anyway, because we're now entering on slide 15 of chapter 8. The second half of this lesson, which is not really about fossils or the change of the earth, but about what we do with it. So how do archaeologists and paleoanthropologists understand what they're looking at, both in terms of the assemblage of things that are found in any particular context. Context is an important word as well, or assemblage. So I mentioned this before, that if there is a fossil that forms on a lake bed or a beach or a riverbed, or a riverbank, the things that cover it are part of that same stratum, that same event, that time and that place, which means that any type of information that is found in those soils is going to be contemporary with the fossils that form in that soil. So that tells us if we can get information about whether that was forest or savanna, whether that was a humid area or a river or a lake itself, right? So these are important things that tell us about the relationships between the adaptations that we see in the fossils and the environment that created the natural selection pressures that made those features adaptable. And the concept of dating things in strata or layers goes back to the 17th century. In fact, when science was brand new, when science was the rules of what science was being formed. And Nicholas Steno, or Niels Stenson, otherwise referred to, came up with what we call the law of superposition. And essentially what this is a layer cake. So if you have a cake, you have to have the bottom layer down first before you can put the next layer down, and the next layer down, and the next layer down, and the next layer down. Which means that the earliest thing, the first thing to go down is the oldest. And the thing on top of that is less old, and less old, and less old, and more recent, until we get to contemporary. So below my feet are layers and layers and layers of strata, of stratified remains that go back in time. So in a perfect sequence, the deepest thing is going to be the oldest, and the shallowest thing is going to be the most recent. This is what we call, from this we can actually just already date things in what we call relative dating. Things are older or more recent than the next. And so if you have a stratum, a particular layer that was laid down, a silt deposit, or some Cretaceous layer of seashells, anything above it, anything above that stratum is going to be later than it. Anything below it is going to be earlier than that. And so even without knowing how old these things are, we can see things like the principle of faunal succession in a real sequence. So we can see the evolution of certain features popping up through time. This also has some principles that I'm not sure your book talks about, but archaeologists use, which is terminus ad quem, AD, terminus ad quem, which means time to which. And so a particular event, like a volcanic eruption, is a terminus ad quem. It's a moment in time that we can pinpoint. And after that, terminus post quem, is after, above that layer of volcanic ash that falls. That's your event, and everything above that is going to be after that event. So, and everything before that will be terminus ante quem, A-N-T-E quem, before which. So something like an extinction event that we saw with the dinosaurs, there's going to be an impact stratum, there's going to be all sorts of changes that take place at this moment of time, this extinction event. Everything before that, you're going to have dinosaurs. Everything after that, you're going to have different life forms starting to emerge through different pressures. So relative dating can already tell us a little bit about the way that evolution works. Even if we can't give a precise date on how old something is, we can put things relative to one another. Also, I talked earlier about hot spots and how we need to fill in the gaps between this location and this location where we find fossils and we find evidence, but there's nothing in between because it doesn't exist, or at least the evidence doesn't exist anymore. But stratigraphic correlation can actually help us there. So if there's an event like a volcanic eruption, if you can find that stratum where a volcanic eruption is in one place and find it in another place, you can actually correlate these. And this is what's called stratigraphic correlation. So you may have a hot spot that is for a particular time period, but then it drops off at a certain time. But then it's picked up in another location, and you can actually, the end of this is the beginning of this, and then so on and so forth. You can create a complete sequence by comparing the different stratigraphic hotspots that you find. So on slide 16, we actually have an element of, or a picture of Krakatoa that exploded in 1883. This was recorded, people saw it happening, it was reported in the newspapers. And so this is a moment in time that it created all this ash, and that became buried, and we now know that everything before that layer of ash, if we go digging and we find it buried, that's earlier than 1883. And anything above it is post-1883. And the moment that took place is 1883. So that's a situation where this sort of thing happened in real time. Once again, this is a uniformitarianism. We've seen this happen in our human experience, but we can also presume that these are the same sort of forces that are taking place. If we understand taphonomy and geology well enough, we can actually do the same sort of thing from much earlier periods. Now, the relative age of fossils we get from the stratum in which they're found, right? So if you find a bunch of fossils all together, you can't necessarily assume that they're all contemporary, because if I could dig it up, it could be dug up in the past as well. So it helps to be able to get some kind of a independent source of dating for the fossils themselves, especially as we saw, sometimes they're just eroding out of the surface. And so can you be confident it's from this layer or that layer if it's washed out and on the ground surface? That's where you find fossils. Do you just reject it because you don't know where it comes from, or do you find some other method of trying to understand its actual age? Well, the first person to attempt to try and independently date a fossil was Dragutin Gorjanovich Kramberger, whose picture you see on slide 17. And he actually, from a cave in Croatia called Krapina, he tried to demonstrate Neanderthal fossils were from individuals who lived at the same time as an extinct rhinoceros, and also cave bears, and whose bones were found in the same cave. And what he did was he saw that certain types of bones absorbed fluorine, the element fluorine, into the fossils at a certain rate, like a fixed rate. And older bones tended to have a higher concentration of fluorine than younger bones. And he was able to show that the fluorine dating of some very deeply stratified deposits in this cave were much higher fluorine concentration than the ones that were less deeply stratified. And he was able to actually put the rhinoceros and the cave bears and the Neanderthals all in the same general grouping of fluorine concentrations, showing that at least to some extent these can be considered relatively contemporary creatures. Maybe not the exact same moment in time, but about the same age. ago. That was the first attempt at trying to chemically date, independently date fossils. Also, the same person, Gorjanovich-Kramberger, he also gave us a technique of trying to look at the types of fossils that occur, like cave bears, right? So cave bears don't exist anymore. It's an extinct species. So if you find fossils in a stratum with cave bears, you know that it has to be earlier than today. But how much earlier? Well, he wasn't giving us an absolute fixed date for that, but if you find other creatures in the same stratum as that cave bear, you might be able to surmise that they were contemporary. So also, if there's extinction events, like I said with things like dinosaurs, if there are dinosaurs, it has to be before they became extinct. But more recently, we have things like the Irish elk. I might have talked about this in a previous lecture. The great Irish elk was adapted to Ice Age European environments, the open tundra, steppe, in cold environments. And when the ice sheets started to recede, the forests started to come in, and this was a maladaptation for that new type of environment. The great Irish elk went extinct. And so if you find something, fossils, a stratum with fossils with a great Irish elk in it, you know it has to be from the end of the Ice Age or earlier. That's a terminus antequem, right? Also, it's not just an all or none. It's not just you find fossils or you don't. Things like pig's teeth are well documented to have changed through time, and you can actually, if you find pig's teeth with particular features to them, you can actually date where in that sequence it is relative to one another. So by working out the evolutionary history of pig fossils, you can infer a relative age of other fossils found in those same strata, like hominins, like us. Also, on slide 19, we have cultural dating. So I said before in the previous lecture that it's not just bones that fossilize, it's everything that comes from the stratum we're trying to put into a single assemblage to try and build up a picture of what things were like at that time. And so objects that are left behind, especially ones that have been manipulated by our ancestors, so artifacts, are things that are important and very telling. And things like ceramics, when we get down to that and the invention of ceramics some 15,000 years ago or so in Japan has the oldest type of pottery. But you can see that style changes through time. Pottery is very flexible, malleable, plastic, and so it is sensitive to what stylistic input people were making out of it. The same thing goes for very early tools. The earliest tools from 2.5 million years ago are very simple, but you can see that they become more complex, they become more imaginative, and they reflect certain cognitive advances that our ancestors were making. And so when you find a particular tool, you can actually date it as well. So you can find the fossils, but sometimes you don't find the fossils and you only find the tools. If the tools were created by hands at work, then you know that those creatures that made them must have been around at some point, even if you don't find their bones. They've gone off and left their tools behind. Now, this may be kind of mysterious to you. I know it was to me when I started doing archaeology. How do you know? You know, you pick up an arrowhead and you say, okay, that's Apache, right? And it'd be great if we could do that. You know, that's what the movies seem to say about being able to identify style and that sort of a thing. But it's really A, not so precise, but B, also not so different from what we do all the time. So you may look at the slide number 19 and say, how can I tell these different time periods? Well, it's familiarity. I'm familiar enough with the ceramics of certain parts of the world, that I can look at them and say, okay, I know where that's from and I know that when that's from, but that's just because I've been studying it for a long time. If you take a case of cultural objects that are more familiar to you or from a more recent time, you can do the same thing. And so on slide 20, don't turn to slide 21 either yet, just do 20. And I want you to challenge yourself and ask yourself, and I want you to look at these. These are basically the same cars. They're all Mercedes-Benz SLs or 300s or something like that. It's not important. They're essentially the same model of car, but they're from different decades. And I chose right in the middle of the decade. So one of them's from 55, one's from 65, one's from 75, 85, 95, 2005, and 2015. And it should not be too challenging for you to actually be able to put these in order, in relative chronological order. Even if you don't know cars, you know the style. You know the assemblage from that time period. You know what looks like 1950s. And you know what looks like 2015. And you know what looks like the 1990s, right? So that's essentially what an archaeologist is doing, is becoming familiar enough with a particular time period that you can start to slot those into some presumed categories. Now, you want to be able to have some data to back that up, but once you become familiar enough with that data, then you can actually start to build this sequence independent of the stratigraphy and the fossils and the dating techniques themselves. So if you go to slide 21, you'll see them in correct order. And I think you probably wouldn't have been too far off in your own attempt. Now, I chose the middle of each decade too because I wanted to remind you that the pieces of this puzzle are not complete, that we don't have every piece of this puzzle. And so we can find something from 1955 and one from 1965. We know that evolution has taken place. Stylistic changes have taken place. And we can tell that the 50s are closer, the 60s are closer to the 50s than to the 70s. But when you get from the 70s to the 80s, there's not so much change. So the pace of change is a little bit different. And also, if you find something from, let's say, 1959, that's great, because you've filled in a gap in between these blocks of time. So 55, 65, but if you find one from 1960 or 59, then you're actually can slot it in between. And you can say, okay, I know where this fits, not because I've seen it before, but because it looks neither like this one, neither like this one, but it's somewhere in between. It's transitional. And that's what we do with fossils as well. We're looking for, when we find a fossil, we try and put it in a relative sequence as to how these adaptations are emerging. The battery's about to run out, so I'm going to pause right here.